Well, let me mention one other federal policy. As I said, there are many, many others. I describe many of them in my book, The Color of Law. I don't have time to go into many of them. But one other that I want to mention is public housing. I'm sure many of you think that public housing is a place where poor people live, lots of single mothers with children, lots of young men, as I said earlier, without jobs in the formal economy, deteriorated buildings. That's our image of public housing. That's not how public housing began in this country. Public housing began in this country. The first public housing created for civilians in this country was in the New Deal in the Roosevelt administration during the Depression. It was not for poor people. Poor people weren't permitted into public housing. We had a high unemployment rate, 25% unemployed. Public housing was for the 75% who had good jobs and could pay the full cost of the housing and their rent. They needed housing from the government because there was no housing being built in the private sector, but these people could afford it. Everywhere that the federal government built housing, the first civilian public housing in this country, and for the next 20 years and more, everywhere it built it, it segregated it with separate projects for African Americans, separate projects for whites, frequently creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed. Because there, as I said earlier, there were many urban integrated neighborhoods at the time. We'd be stunned if we were transported back to that period of American history to see the extent of urban integration that existed. The great African-American poet, novelist, playwright Langston Hughes wrote in his autobiography that he grew up in an urban downtown Cleveland, Ohio neighborhood. He said his best friend in high school was Polish. He dated a Jewish girl. It's what you'd expect in an integrated high school, an integrated neighborhood. The Public Works Administration went into that neighborhood, that integrated neighborhood of Cleveland, and built two separate projects, one for African Americans, one for whites, creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed, and then reinforcing it with other segregated projects elsewhere in Cleveland. In my book, The Color of Law, I like to talk where I can about self-satisfied, smug places. They think they're better than others. Cambridge, Massachusetts is an example. Cambridge, Massachusetts in the 1930s, the area between Harvard and MIT was a fully integrated community called the Central Square neighborhood. Public Works Administration went into that Central Square neighborhood, demolished housing, and built two separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, and with that and other projects elsewhere in the Boston area, perpetuated, reinforced, and created a pattern of segregation that exists to this day. The very first public housing project that the federal government built was in Atlanta. Atlanta had segregated schools and segregated water fountains and segregated lunch counters and segregated buses, but it had integrated neighborhoods for the reasons I described before. The Public Works Administration went into that city, Atlanta, and in the neighborhood called the Flats, an integrated neighborhood, built public housing for whites only, forcing the African Americans who were displaced from that integrated neighborhood to find less adequate housing elsewhere to double, triple up with relatives. During World War II, this policy became even more accentuated. Hundreds of thousands of workers flocked to centers of war production to take jobs in war industries. They overwhelmed the communities to which they migrated. If the federal government wanted the tanks and the jeeps and the aircraft carriers to be built, it had to find housing for those workers, and it did everywhere. The federal government built housing for war workers during World War II. It segregated it with separate projects for whites, separate projects for African Americans, creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed. In particular, the West Coast is a great example of this because there were very few African Americans living on the West Coast prior to World War II. The great migration of African Americans out of the former slaveholding states into the rest of the country didn't touch the West Coast until World War II. Prior to that, there was migration into Detroit, and Chicago, and New York, and other Midwestern and Eastern cities, but not to the West Coast. The first massive migration of African Americans to the West Coast take place during World War II. There were no segregated neighborhoods prior to that, but the federal government created them with housing for war workers on a segregated basis. In San Francisco, for example, the federal government built 5 projects for war workers. mostly shipyard workers working together in the shipyards, but having to live separately in segregated projects. 4 were for white war workers only. 1 was for African Americans, placed in a neighborhood that became the African American neighborhood of San Francisco. And the same policy was pursued in Portland and Seattle and Los Angeles, up and down the West Coast, to create segregation where it hadn't previously existed. Well, there were many, many other policies, as I said, to create segregation on the part of the federal, state, and local governments. We have an unconstitutional system of segregation, something that we have an obligation to remedy. The remedies, the ways to redress segregation, are well known. There's no mystery about them whatsoever. The policy writers, housing experts, think tanks throw out ideas all the time about what to do about segregation. What's missing is not policy ideas about how to fix segregation. What's missing is a new civil rights movement that's going to make it as uncomfortable to maintain segregation in neighborhoods as the civil rights movement of the 1960s made it uncomfortable to maintain segregation of public accommodations and transportation and other areas of life. The Fair Housing Act that we passed is incapable of addressing residential segregation. To take the example I gave before of Levittown, those homes, those $100,000 homes that now sell for $500,000 are unaffordable to working class families of either race, even middle class families of either race, if they don't have down payments from the wealth that they've inherited from parents to buy homes. So by passing a law in 1968 that said in effect to African Americans, okay, you can now move to Levittown. We're not going to stop you anymore. Federal policy no longer prevents you from doing so. But very few can afford to move there. Levittown is in a neighborhood that's about 15% African American. As a result of the Fair Housing Act, some African Americans are able to afford to move to a community with homes sell for $500,000. And as a result, Levittown is now about 2% African American. But that gap between the 2% that the Fair Housing Act was able to accomplish and the 15% that you would expect based on the composition of its broader neighborhood, that difference is what the Fair Housing Act is incapable of redressing.